Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you a review of the Yasuhara Anthy 35mm F1.8. Now, this is a lens from a small boutique Japanese lens maker, Yasuhara, who is releasing the Anthy 35mm for Canon RF, which I'm reviewing on here today, also on Nikon Z and then Sony FE. So kind of the major full-frame mirrorless mounts at this point the lens is being released for. As you can see, it is a compact lens, beautifully constructed, all in metal, very much like classic Zeiss look. And it has some unique optical properties that really put me in mind of some of the vintage lenses that I reach for on occasion. And so today we're going to explore its strengths and its weaknesses and maybe give you a sense of whether or not it is or is not a lens for you. Now, coming to market at a price point of $299 US, it makes it one of the cheapest lenses available for the Canon RF mount at the moment. And so, of course, that will, make it of interest to some people, though there isn't a huge difference between that price point and Canon's own RF 35mm F1.8 IS macro lens. So let's explore this lens today and see whether or not it might be a lens that you could use. First of all, we'll take a look at the build and the handling of the lens. Let's jump in and take a closer look hands-on. So let's take a closer look at the Yasuhara, and this is the Anthy 35mm F1.8. And so first of all, looking up front, you can see front fascia here. We have something unique in that we have a retractable lens hood that doesn't really stay in place all that well, but as long as there's nothing hitting it, it should be fine. But it provides some shading and it's always there. So anyway, kind of an old school thing I've seen on some lenses before. Up front, we've got a 52mm front filter thread, but that is actually in this portion here. That's where you thread in, not in the outer. The actual diameter of the lens is a fair bit wider by comparison. The actual diameter of the lens is 72mm, and so that means we've got an extra 20mm from the filter threads, and so a little bit of a unique design when it comes to that. So taking a look at the lens mounted here on the camera before we take it off, you can see that this would constitute one of the most compact lenses available on the RF mount at this point, and is fairly similar in size to the actual RF 35mm f1.8 macro IS lens. So we'll pop it off the camera here and take a little bit closer look at the lens itself. So first of all metal construction, very nice, nicely built, in kind of a retro style. Kind of the look of the imprinting on here. It has an aesthetic that's somewhat similar to like vintage Zeiss lenses, or what's now called the Classic series. And similarly, our focus ring is metal ribs here, but with the actual distance markings on there. So as we actually focus, you can see that the lens doesn't really change length, and so it is internally focusing here, and so you can see that it does front focus. You can see it moving inside the internal housing front and back, but it's all within the internal housing there. So focus ring moves nice and smooth. Damping is fairly heavy on it, but enough to where if you're making small adjustments, you can do it with precision. Down here at the bottom, you have the manual aperture ring. And so outside of the 1/3 stop between 1.8 and f2, it is all just full stop click detents. And so, I do prefer a little bit more finite control, but everything here is nice and definite. And again, the weight is fairly heavy on it, but there's strongly marked detents to let you know where the full stop aperture values are. We've got a sturdy metal lens mount here. We've got some nice construction here at the rear. No electronic communication of any kind, and that does create a few interesting things that we'll detail as a part of the review. As you can see, overall length is only 64mm long, so it is very, very nice and compact, and it weighs in at about 408 grams due to the fairly heavy construction. Internally, we have got 9 elements in 7 groups as the optical design. So a lot of good things there. Beautiful medical construction, beautiful focus ring, about 170 degrees of focus throw, a nice precise aperture ring, but no electronics and no weather sealing, so some liabilities when it comes to that. I will just note one quirk on the on the EOS R. It has a really cool manual focus aid called the Focus Guide. I've discovered, however, that it doesn't actually activate if you have a lens without electronics attached. For some reason, it seems somewhat reliant on that. And so even though if I'm adapting lenses, if they have some electronics, it will show up. And it's a really, really cool manual focus aid. No electronics, like with this lens, it doesn't show up. And so you know, and then obviously you're not going to get automatic magnification of the image because there's no electronic communication. You can, of course, manually magnify the image to help to visually confirm focus, and you can use focus overlays, of course, focus peaking to help you with it. Either way, I've had pretty good success rate on the EOS R in terms of nailing focus with the lens, with the combination of those assets. Now, of course, beyond that of interest is going to be the optical properties of the lens. And so we'll start by going in and looking at photos together and highlighting some strengths and weaknesses of the lens. Let's take a look at that. So we'll start off by looking at vignette and distortion from the Anthy. And so as you can see, distortion is essentially non-existent, so not a problem in the least. Vignette is another story. It is quite heavy, as you can see, and required a fair bit of correction, moving up into the 75-ish range on quantity and moving the midpoint pretty much at f1.8, moving it almost all the way to the end. As you can see, I was able to, with a little bit of work, to produce a very clean looking end result, but certainly that is something that you're going to have to deal with manually or to create a profile yourself, because there are no electronics to communicate anything for a profile to be automatically applied. Now, specific to the Canon RF mount is a little bit of an oddity when it comes to interaction with either the coatings or the color science on Canon, in that, as you can see, there is a vignette that will kind of skew to a color cast, typically more of a magenta cast, and it really kind of depends on the color balance here. I found that after I changed the white balance on the image on the right, that the color of the vignette changed, and so I had to try to pull that down in a different way. What I ended up doing to remove the color cast is I just grabbed the eyedrop sampler in Lightroom here, sampled that color and then pulled those particular levels down. And so after the white balance correction here, what I ended up with was actually a kind of mostly magenta, a little bit purple range. And prior to changing the white balance, it was more of a yellow orange here in the corner. And so anyway, just kind of a weird thing, phenomenon on Canon R that doesn't seem to be there on either Nikon Z or Sony FE. But anyway, we'll just something to watch out for. So taking a look at resolution here, this is the corrected image. You can see center of the frame, we've got pretty good contrast and sharpness there. And that's true as we move up here. There's a little bit of a loss of contrast, mid-frame, but you can see there's still good resolution there. A little bit of a fade here in the corners, as you can see at f1.8. Now, if you're shooting kind of in the sweet spot of the lens at f1.8, we can see if we look in here, this is on the EOS R, we've got nice resolution, skin textures and tones look good, and so nothing to be concerned about there. Here also, you can see I've done just a little bit of tone curve work to this image, but you can see good sharpness and a nice looking end result even at f1.8. Now, colors on the lens itself tend to be a little bit warm, and so again, kind of an analog vintage kind of feel. And so it works really well in restaurant type, bar type environments, or other similar things where that warmth is desirable. Here's a couple of images that kind of to show that, and so I think it works really well for that kind of venue. Less so obviously when we're shooting out those kind of pristine snowy conditions. It's not a great look for that. Now, there's not a significant change from f1.8 to f2. However, here at f2.8 on the right, you can see that contrast has really kicked up, and sharpness, center sharpness and contrast look fantastic. Also moving up here, mid-frame now looks quite good. And moving into the corner here, we can see that it's not quite 100% into the corners, but we can see that, looking into this zone, that resolution is starting to increase. Stepping on down to f4, adds a lot of contrast and resolution, basically all the way up until like the last 1 degree in the corners, and so we've got a very sharp, crisp result by then. Finally, at f5.6, we see that finally that last little bit in the corner clears up, and now you've got very, very crisp resolution right across the frame. Going back to this image that we showed the color cast on earlier, but some correction, we can see that the actual image itself here, shot at landscape apertures of f5.6, it's really, really sharp across the frame. Good contrast, looks really fantastic. Here's another type image shot across a frozen lake, but it just gives us a nice swath all across the frame where you can see really crisp delineation of the image. Now, one other oddity I will kind of transition towards is when it comes to flare. You can see that the center portion of this frame has kind of a purple look to it that doesn't match the rest of the color, and that is actually an artifact from the sun in the frame here at this point. So if we look at a more controlled test, we see that at wide apertures, there's a little less of the flare, like in terms of the ghosting, but you can see kind of a generalized purpley kind of effect that is in the zone. We can see if we look over at the f11 result that that zone has grown exponentially, and so there is a very unique kind of affecting of the image to where it goes to a very kind of purple color cast, and so something really unique, and so it's either going to be a huge liability if you're shooting into the sun. For some of you, there might be some people who find it an artistic look that they like, maybe for filmmaking. Here's another example that shows that even at a wider aperture, you can see that where the sun is, which the sun is right in this area here, where there is that kind of ghosting or veiling pattern, you can see that purpley kind of color tone has come into the image. Now, longitudinal chromatic aberrations are not perfectly corrected, but fairly well controlled. We can see a little bit of purple fringing here before, a little bit of green afterward. But as is often the case, the trade-off for having not perfectly corrected longitudinal chromatic aberrations tends to be a really nice bokeh performance. And let's take a look at that. First of all, a look at geometry. You can see there is a little bit of deformation towards the edge of the frame. It's not terrible, however. It's not as squeezed as what we see sometimes. The bokeh circles here that are towards the center of the frame are really, really fantastic, as you can see. Very little activity inside them, so they're nice and smooth. The inner line is not hard, and so there's a nice transition to defocus. Very, very nice looking. And that kind of brings us to what I consider to be a real strength for the lens, and that's the kind of rendering here. You can see a beautiful melting away to the bokeh there. You can see really nice sharpness because we're in this kind of sweet spot of resolution. You can see it's really, really nice looking. Chromatic aberration is not a big factor here, so a really beautiful end result. Here's another, and this is a little bit more into the kind of the transition zone area. So it's a little bit busier, but still quite a nice image. And so it's handled even the busier results with some aplomb, I would say here. We have a little bit of that ghosting artifact in this image with the sun like right here out of the frame. But there are situations that if you just kind of position the camera correctly, you get fairly little impact, as we have had here. Here's one more example that just shows how smooth the bokeh is and the defocused area. Very, very nice. Now moving indoors with that, just to, kind of a Christmas decoration, we can see there's just about a foot beyond the decoration. There's this mirror here. We can just see everything on it kind of melt away very, very nicely. So I'm quite impressed with that. This gives us a look at minimum focus here, and so our magnification is not listed. I'm going to guess it at 0.18 or 0.19, somewhere in that range. And we can see up that close-up performance is fairly good. There's a little bit of loss of contrast, and detail isn't amazing, but it's actually fairly good here. Not a bad performance on that. One final thing to evaluate is when it comes to the Coma performance. So in the center of the frame, star points are fairly good, not perfect. However, if we move off towards the edges of the frame, we can see that there's definitely some Coma there. It looks like maybe an angel soaring through the air. And so, but anyway, we definitely see some Coma towards the edge. It's usable, but it certainly is not a strong performance when it comes to the Coma control. So as you can see, there are some weird things that are there. Certainly the discolored vignette is a factor. Fortunately, it does seem to be limited for whatever reason to the Canon RF mount, and there's been no such kind of reports coming back from reviewers on either the Nikon Z or Sony FE platform. So if you're looking at it for those, probably not an issue. On Canon it's a solvable problem, but you do need to have a little bit of expertise when it comes to post-processing if you're going to eliminate it. Of course, it's really magnified by the shooting environment that I'm in right now, and unfortunately, kind of some of the common shots that I will shoot during winter, outdoors, snow, it really magnifies some of the limitations of this lens. I don't really think that that's its strength. It's really designed more. It's going to be a great autumn lens with a little bit more warmer characteristic. It's going to be, as I noted in looking at photos, it's going to be a great lens for shooting like in restaurants and bars, things like that, where you're a little bit warmer, more analog kind of look is actually really beneficial. I think there's a lot of applications for it, but this is a lens much like some of the vintage lenses that I referenced at the beginning, that needs to be used to its strengths with an understanding of what it is and what it is not, what it's good at and what it is not good at. And I think that if you bear that in mind and go into it, it certainly can produce some really beautiful images. And certainly just giving a quick kind of just experience comparison to the RF 35mm f1.8. There is one area where the Anthy definitely takes the win, and that is when it comes to the quality of the bokeh and the bokeh rendering, which is much nicer, much softer on this particular lens. Now, there's a whole lot of other strengths that the Canon RF lens has compared to this, but just case in point. So in conclusion, why would you choose a lens like this, even if its price point is lower than comparative lenses? Well, obviously price is a factor. Another thing though is that, as I've noted, in certain situations, this is going to give you really, really unique, beautiful images. Some of you, many of you, I should start by saying, many of you who fall more into the mainstream are less a little bit maybe artsy in your photography. You're looking for the best tool to do the job, sharpest, best set of features, all of those typical things that I'm detailing and praising usually at this point in a review. This lens doesn't have all of those things, but there are a percentage of you that are more interested in artful rendering than what you are in, kind of more clinical sharpness or optical correction. And this may be a lens that would catch your eye for that reason. So just like as I reach for something like the SMC Tacumar 50mm f1.4, well, it has thorium elements, and in one of the elements it has thorium in it, which kind of yellows a little bit over time. So it gives it a very warm kind of look. And yet I reach for that sometimes, even though it's not optically perfect, for the same reason that I would reach for the Anthy 35mm. In some situations, that warm look gives a quality to images that is really quite special. And I think that that would be true of this lens as well. And then, of course, the other reason why one might reach for this is a simple fact that a good manual focus lens with a good smooth manual focus ring with a good range, good control, if you're a filmmaker, gives you a lot more control over things like focus pulls than what, particularly with mirrorless. Mirrorless is great if you want autofocus all the time. However, if you want to have finite control of what's in focus and how focus pulls are achieved, mirrorless lenses are not great for that. And so a good manual focus lens could be a real asset for you for that job as well. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, I do have a full text review, and so you can check out more information there. There's also a linkage there to my image gallery if you'd like to look at photos and kind of get a sense of whether the feel of the lens works for you. Beyond that, there are buying links there if you'd like to purchase one for yourself, and there is a discount code that will get you 10% off at Yasuhara's website if you want to order it from them. And of course, there's linkage there to follow me on social media, to become a patron, to sign up for my newsletter. And if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.